If you study history closely enough, and there's no denying that education can provide plethora of opportunities, and especially pay closer attention to human civilization. Education not only opened up doors, but also it challenged human beings to think more, especially when we look at this complicated world. Now, in this episode, we need to talk about what's happening today in the education world. Now, Harvard University, as one of the most prestigious university and also well-known around the world. Now, recently, Harvard University started this firing exchange with the Trump administration. News headline came one after another. And for example, Trump administration threatens Harvard's ability to host international students. Another one read that Trump administration cuts $2.2 billion Harvard funding after university defies demands. How do we understand that? And as one of the most prestigious universities in the world, what does that mean to face the battle against the Trump administration? And meanwhile, that Harvard University is not only well-known domestically, but also internationally. Outside the US, younger generations are also following what's going on between Trump and Harvard. And how does that relate to the trade war between US and China at this moment? And in this episode, we're going to talk about all of them. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor again to invite our distinguished speaker, who is Dr. Michael Patrick. Again, if you follow our show, Dr. Michael Patrick has been a frequent guest, and he's a well-known international journalist, and also he's an amazing professor, teaches on leadership and business and international politics. Well, Michael, and welcome back to the show.
Well, thank you, Will. I always enjoy being on with your audience.
Thank you, Dr. Patrick. Well, Michael, I want to get started. As we mentioned before, the first topic is not only drew attention in the US, but also across the continent as well, that this is an ongoing battle between Trump administration and Harvard University. Now, despite that what Trump administration demanded from Harvard University, I want to read a statement from the current president of Harvard. And this is what he said, that, and I quote, Harvard is committed to fighting anti-Semitism, but that no government should stifle academic freedom, end quote. Dr. Patrick, you are one of the amazing scholars, and of course we know that education could open up doors and change the world. But right now, one thing that we don't understand outside the US is what is really the battle about between Harvard and Trump. And also, a lot of people are showing this sadness, and of course more about this frustration, and knowing that Trump administration decided to cut $2.2 billion in Harvard funding, a lot of political scientists, or especially from different colleges within Harvard, are really worried about this research project, on cancer, on the medical advancement or virus. So putting everything together, can you help us to understand why this is so crucial, and what does that mean when we're seeing the battle between Trump and Harvard at this moment?
Well, context is everything in these sorts of things, isn't it? The context being that this is not the first university that the Trump team has taken a close look at in terms of their compliance with federal regulations. There are 6 other major universities, but Harvard is the behemoth on the block. They are the largest endowment of any of their own money, means that is invested for them to spend, of about $53 billion. Their war chest is bigger than the GDP of 100 different countries. It is a heavyweight in the world of not only academia, but in terms of influence with the work that it does. And but what about that context? The context is you had an election, not 100 some days ago. So you have a situation where, or a swearing in of Trump's time in office, and it was a divide. I call it a mimetic tribe. It just means that these people shared significantly different values, and between Trump and Biden and Kamala Harris. And yet, so yes, Trump took over. Trump won the election clearly. That's not in dispute. but you still have all of these people and all this political elites who are being disenfranchised. If you look in the Washington bureau areas in Washington, D.C., it's like he's draining the swamp and cutting trillions of dollars, hope is their ambition, out of federal spending. And somebody needed to step up and resist what Trump has been doing. And they're trying to make accomplishments in the courts. This will probably end up in court. But right now, it's Harvard is positioned as one who can afford, perhaps in their own mind at least, to fight and resist. If it costs them some $2.3 billion frozen, if that's tied up for a while, that's really a small amount when you consider their overall endowment. And of course, Americans are wondering, why are we giving them $2.3 billion when they are the largest endowment in the world? But that's a separate issue that's going to keep this alive, is the debate about what's happening in higher education. Higher education is under a great deal of scrutiny, and people feel that it's falling behind. But that's the context. It is a culture war taking place involving higher education. The elite schools, these are 6 of the 7 are elite Ivy League schools that represent and house a great deal of that progressive outlook on life. And that outlook is not shared by the majority of Americans. And that's why the election turned out the way it did. And so consequently, they're butting heads about it.
Well, Michael, again, you said it. Among all the Ivy League universities, that Harvard is not the only one. And if I remember correctly, current president of Princeton University also wrote a co-op on New York Times. And I guess the message was crystal clear that despite what the Trump administration demanded, it's time to speak up and take a stand for what's right. And again, according to the president of Princeton University. But meanwhile, some believe that because this whole ongoing battle, the Trump administration has created a lose-lose situation for many of Americans' educational institutions, as it pressures university to meet demand or risk losing fundings. So, but Dr. Patrick, another matter that we still don't understand is based on the constitutional perspective. Those prestigious universities defended what's right by saying that Donald Trump or Trump administration, it's actually violating the First Amendment of freedom of speech. Again, Michael, I'm not the expert in Constitution. Again, nor did I ever study to become a scholar in that field. But I know that within the First Amendment, the freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, there's so much content to it. So from your perspective as a scholar, do you think that this is a violation of First Amendment or this is a violation of freedom of speech? How does that argue align with what Trump is doing or what the university is trying to defy at this moment?
Well, the advantage that Trump has is he has the law and the regulation on his side. And you can claim free speech in all kinds of situations until you violate the law. And then it ends up in court. And that's why I said this will probably end up as an issue in court. There are all kinds of regulations that they are refusing now to obey. If you had talked to them during the Biden administration and Biden raised an issue, they would certainly do what they could to comply. And I think that would normally be the case. And certainly we've seen back and forth about these regulations over the years. I think in one way that Harvard is hoping they can hold out for 4 years and then the laws will be changed back to accommodate their more progressive worldview. But the majority of Americans have weighed in on this, and the law is fairly clear at this stage. They're not going to be able to get an easy win in the courts against some of the regulations. But even the courts have begun to shift. And so that's why I think we're looking at eventually court cases and resistance by these organizations, even if it costs them money, with the belief that they'll eventually get it back. And you have to look at this internationally. I think you brought up a very good point about people watching this from internationally point of view. I mean, Harvard and all the rest of the schools could suddenly lose the ability to bring foreign students in, international students in, with the visas to study. And this could affect a great number of students throughout the United States. Certainly China itself. China is one of the biggest donor nations to Harvard University. And there are anywhere from 1,400 to 1,800, I've heard different estimates, of Chinese students studying at Harvard. This is an important issue for not just China, but for a lot of other, what did the students do to start this problem? Well, maybe there were some protests. Maybe there were some issues involving those protests that drew the ire of the government. And I think that this is why this is going to end up in litigation. And I think they're doubling down on the idea they can weather the storm of Donald Trump for 4 years, even if it costs the money. But behind that is the movement that divided the nation in the very election itself. This fight didn't suddenly end on election day.
Well, Michael, I want to bring in another key Trump cabinet member into our conversation, who is the Department of Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem. And now she warned that Harvard, that its certification to enroll foreign students or international students is contingent upon its complying with federal immigration rules. And now she took this to social media and she wrote, "It's a privilege to have foreign students attend Harvard University, not a guarantee." So again, Michael, as we mentioned before, Harvard University is not only well-known domestically, but also internationally, particularly in China. And the younger generations and the kids are still eyeing to go to Harvard because, again, we know the name. It's Harvard. It's Princeton, right? It's a privilege to be there. It's a privilege to become academically successful through Harvard. Now, but look back from this international perspective, based on your background and so your traveling experiences domestically and so internationally, how much impact are we seeing right now? Do you think that by seeing this battle between Trump and Harvard, is that going to discourage international students to attend Harvard or Princeton, or on the other side, could propel students internationally to go to Harvard despite what Trump did? What do you think of that?
Well, interesting what's happening with the students, because I'm part of an international faculty, and we have students from 60 countries at the small university in Lithuania where I'm located. So we're very used to what happens with international students. But University of British Columbia in Canada has seen a 25% rise in international students from the United States who are getting out of the United States and going to universities abroad. First of all, it's often less expensive. You get a much richer education. You hear me pitching the idea of an international education. Going to different countries, going to China, going elsewhere to get your education. If what's going to consume your campus is raw politics, then you might want to consider going somewhere where you get a more balanced education that's less one side pitted against another in a controversy. Some people would like to just get a very solid, reliable education. And it doesn't have to be at one of the popular Ivy League schools on the East Coast. There are schools across the country that are excellent. And you know what? They don't get $2.3 billion to build their endowments, and they struggle with low tuition, and they struggle with trying to pay the bills and do things in a way that most Americans actually relate to. So there's going to be some culture. This is a culture clash as well between the kind of culture that is at war here. I have watched the other night when I was seeing top American athletes, females, who were talking about the terrible experiences that they had been through with biological males being in the dressing room, taking positions and winning the trophies against them on a physical competition, which is from a biological point of view is already been determined as pretty unfair. And so it's there's a lot of issues at stake in this that'll play itself out. I think a lot of American students are going overseas. The numbers tend to show that, and that's great. That might actually be a healthy solution for people looking for a quality education. Is look for somewhere where they're not fighting with each other all the time, and where the faculty is more wedded to issues and politics than they are to actually teaching. One of the biggest criticisms, this is a hot topic for people like me, because we see there needs to be more investment in teaching and making sure these students are equipped when they graduate to be able to compete. And that's not been the case. We're seeing more and more trouble with students coming prepared into college and leaving ready for the world that they're facing. They don't need to be involved in skirmishes that are not going to change the world around them for the better at a time when they really need to be getting prepared.
Well, Michael, I want to move on to a related topic. Of course, when we talk about international reputations, we have to talk about China. Last time you and I, we had the conversation, just the beginning of the trade war between the two countries. Now, let's bring some of the facts in before we elaborate. Recently, the Chinese president just wrapped up his quick trip or a trip to Vietnam, to Malaysia, and to Cambodia. Needless to say that for Chinese president this time, the trip was rather fruitful and productive. Not only that he was able to strengthen the relationship between China among those key members in Southeast Asia, but also, according to the state media, that it regained the reputation for China as well. Now, just at the same time, the current Italian prime minister also paid a short visit to the White House under this huge influence of the media that Donald Trump, as the sitting U.S. president, the promise able to work with the European countries regarding the trade war. Now, Michael, I'm looking at the article right now, and it titled, China has a plan to win Trump's trade war. Now, based on the Trump statement recently, he said, and I quote, "The ball is in China's court. China needs to make a deal with us. We don't have to make a deal with them," end quote. Michael, from your perspective, you know the funny sketch that I remember back in the days I used to watch? It's called Who's on First, What's on Second, and I don't know on Third. Something like that, right? So if I may borrow the skit a bit, Michael, who's on first right now? So in other words, who's going to make the first move? And Trump said, we don't have to make a deal with them. So is China ready to make a move first? Or we still on the second base? Whoa, I guess what's on second or third is, I don't know. What do you take on that?
Well, if we back up for just a second on this whole thing, this started out with kind of like a fire hose of chaos with everybody pulled into the tariff war, everybody disputing it, ridiculous kinds of tariff numbers being bounced around, and it created a pattern of chaos. But after everybody was kind of alarmed and the markets were shaken up and this chaos was pretty prevailing, then Trump stepped in, and I think this is all part of the strategic use of chaos, and pulled a lot of it back. They've dropped a lot of them. There's still going to be some significant tariffs, but they're negotiating those tariffs across the board. it's quite clear when the chaos died down that this was really about China. That most of this tariff talk was really aimed at China. Now we've seen the Prime Minister of Italy, Meloni, come to the White House. I think and Trump was talking with her about, hey, we're going to settle these tariff issues with all of Europe. He was talking about the EU, not simply Italy. And I think we will see some kind of changes take place there. This was part of how Trump operates, using chaos to create an environment that he feels he can get the best deal in. And so it's going to come down to, you and I were talking one of the last times, we said those two are going to have to get together at some point because both sides need the levels of trade that they can do with each other, regardless of how they want to spin it so that one's has an advantage over another. But that's coming, and we all see that that's coming. Some of the chaos will probably take a while to die down. By the way, this week as well, the word is being put out that the U.S. doesn't plan to stay dealing with Russia and Ukraine. They're planning to pull out if they don't see some real progress on Russia's side or something miraculous they're expecting from Ukraine, who keeps getting hit. They're going to back out of that, and they're going to start reducing and focusing a little more after that first giant 100-day burst of chaos, and start focusing on what their priorities will be. So I think that the issue, all this has done is reinforce how important this issue is for both China and the United States. And we'll start seeing movement on that as they deal with the smaller issues of trade with with Southeast Asia and other places and Europe.
Well, Michael, another piece of facts that we need to put into consideration is when we look at the trade war, again, based on numerous economists or political scientists that believe that both sides, which is China and the U.S., would suffer in a rupture, but China's losses would be harder to replace. When we are looking at the trade war and the political tension between U.S. and China, something else is also going to take place this weekend. Is the second round of talk between the representatives from the U.S. and also the representatives, or should I say government officials, from the nation of Iran. If I'm not mistaken, that last Saturday, both sides initiated the first talk. So Michael, again, you know this better than I do. If U.S. truly cares about what's happening in Iran, the tension between Iran and Israel at this moment, China can be a key player because Iran has been growing financially, or should I say economically, closer to China than ever. So that's why people, again, from the Chinese perspective, we're also watching what's going to happen between U.S. and Iran for the second round. First round, it was a nice talk. But the second round, there's a possibility that gloves are off. So which means Donald Trump is looking for a deal or looking for some type of surprise that bringing home from the Middle East to the U.S. Now, at this moment, I want to ask the question, when we are looking at Iran and U.S., U.S. and China, how much do you think that this talk between U.S. and Iran could be a turning point for U.S. and China at this moment? So in other words, perhaps that if everything goes well between U.S. and Iran, that China could actually get a better deal from Trump, perhaps that Trump is willing to lower the tariff or even perhaps to soften the tones simply because China is willing to help with the Iran situation. What do you think of that?
Well, I think that the role of China in the Iran issue is a critical one. They are a main supplier of oil for China. I think they're a major client. I think it's an important issue in that regard. And I want to say about the tariffs before we leave that. These tariffs are not going to be overnight deals. These tariffs are going to take months, if not years, to sort out. but the talks will get started. The problem is you don't already have a system in place for managing these talks. So it is going to take a great deal of time. I think that translates into even the issue with China is going to take a lot longer than anybody might imagine it would do. It's not something they're going to solve in a few months. And I don't know how it's going to keep its. And I think that China is looking to strengthen its outlets into the world for energy, its needs whether or not they're named in certain talks or not. It remain, we'll see. But I know that China is sitting at the table anytime there's a conversation going on.
Now, look ahead. We're still seeing the war in Ukraine, and also we're still seeing this tariff war between U.S. and China. Now, more experts came out recently to believe that countries such as Russia, China, and North Korea are doing what struggling autocracies have long done, turning to the military to secure their regimes. Dr. Patrick, I'm not an expert on military, but from your perspective, is it fair today, when we're seeing China, when we're seeing Russia, is it still fair to put China and Russia and North Korea within the same category? Because clearly Russia is very much occupied with the war in Ukraine. China is occupied with its political and economic ambition. North Korea is no longer an isolated country, but that's a separate topic. So how do we understand the three countries at this moment, not just from political standpoint, but from the realistic aspect? What do you say to that?
Well, it is what they call a multipolarity world. They are all within their own spheres of influence, and it's not a simple task of the three of them getting together and having a deal. You have three entirely different worldviews, ambitions, and processes. This is going to continue to roll on for many years. I think Europe is understanding that it is going to have to live with the consequences of Ukraine, for better or worse, that the United States is going to withdraw itself from much of Europe. There is a possibility of trade getting on a better keel than it is now, but which is something that Europe would like to see happen, because they are not doing well from a financial point of view, and I think that Europe would like to see that trade improve. That's separate, but at the same time, they're looking at what the role of NATO is going to be, because if the United States pulls out of NATO or reduces its role in NATO, the threat and the encouragement to Russia to get bolder beyond Ukraine is pretty high. The talk in all the nations in Europe that I monitor are not if there's going to be a war.
Well, Michael, I want to wrap up our conversation by asking you the last question. Now, again, let's go back to what Trump is doing domestically and internationally. The last question I want to ask is, some believe that the goal for Donald Trump to delegate such affairs domestically and also internationally, the goal isn't just to win a great power contest. His goal is to channel it. So I want to hear your final thoughts. Do you think that the strategy or the political methodology that Donald Trump is using today for domestic, for international, it's not to win a great power contest, but actually channel the power to make a louder noises? Want to hear your final thoughts.
Final thoughts: that the United States needs the raw materials from China to build the industry infrastructure that it wants to have in the United States and to bring more business into the United States. So there has to be an agreement, because the U.S. does not have those raw materials. At the same time, China needs that kind of retail outlet of people buying their everything that they offer. A huge amount of trade deficit from sales into the United States that will boost boost companies and operations and investment happening in China. So they both need each other in that exchange. But you're right. China's looking at China, and Trump is looking at the domestic United States and what he can achieve during his 4 years to, as he says, make America better again, make America greater again. And these sideshows with some of the universities, I think, are just that. They're sideshows from the point of view of what Trump's primary focus is going to be.
Well, again, Michael, regardless whether Trump is going to make America great again or make America healthier again or better again, but the goal is, as you and I would discuss before, leaders of the world today demands disruptors and demands disruptions, and so that we can understand what the future holds. So we don't know what will happen between US and China, again, the trade war, or even this whole fire exchange between Trump and Harvard. But it is worth discussing that the intention or the real purposes of those actions, and hopefully that we continue to see what will be unwrapped and we have a better answer, and the whole world, I'm sure it's very excited to see a better solution for either of the dilemmas. I mean, again, Michael, really appreciate your comments, and always a pleasure to talk to you, speak to you, and hopefully next time we had a conversation not just about US-China and not just about the Harvard or Princeton. It's something beyond that. As I mentioned before, that maybe next time you and I can sit together with Michelle Obama or Joe Rogan that to talk about nothing but life and principles. So thank you so much for doing this.
You're the next Joe Rogan in China, so we've got that part of it settled. I look forward to future conversations.
Thank you.